Today, this is an interesting topic today that's usually not talked about in this whole thing because it's sort of skipped over as being fluffy extras. They're not really fluffy extras. They are significant manuscripts that tell us about the oldest Vulgate, the oldest Latin. And the Latin, people would say Latin, that has nothing to, it's just so secondary to Greek or Hebrew. Well, it's not, because it was translated. It's a translation very early. So 400s, 500s, and remember, a lot of our significant Greek manuscripts are penned after the 400s, or probably like 700, 800, 900. So these are actually pretty interesting. These special interest ones are fascinating for a couple of reasons. So I'm glad he covered it on the way through the book, because they pop up in places that you least suspect them, and they're historically relevant. These illustrated Bibles, we call them, because they have all these paintings and stuff in them. They were largely done this way to make them palatable to a common man, to make them attractive. And because of that, not just to church people, but to everybody who could come in and look at them. They also have these things that we are used to today. It's kind of like study Bibles from medieval times. So they had, as we recognize today, the traditional titles of the books. But they have endnotes, in some of them, like who wrote this and where is this from and stuff like that. So it was actually study Bible stuff in the 600s, 700s. It's kind of interesting. They also have chapter headings, but they're not like the modern ones. For instance, Matthew has 68 of them in these. So what they did, which actually, and you can see the counts on the other. Luke has 83. Luke's a big gospel. But there's so many of them, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to take every single scene and give it a chapter name, which actually makes more sense than what we have right now. So every distinguishable scene gets its own number, and you'll see why in a second. As they organize the Bible, they organize the New Testament, they're going to use all these scenes individually. So they don't want to say chapter something, verse something. They want to say this scene, and so that's what these chapters are. They're more like real scenes. I've looked at many of them in Luke, and they're really good divisions. I wish we kept these. It also has introductions to the books in the front, who wrote them and what this is about and stuff like that. Also, almost all of them have little bios on the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and on Paul, and et cetera. It talks about who these guys were. Stuff that we know today, but in the 6th and 7th century, it was like, who? So, and to the uneducated. So it's got that in the front of it. Also, marginal notes are all through it, and little commentaries. It's very much like our study Bibles, but this was being done back in like 600, 700, 800 AD. Whoa! So it's really very cool. Also, and this I wish we kept today, the Eusebian canons, which were written in the 4th century. 4th century is 300s. So yeah, so this is really old. The Eusebian canons were put together. They eventually made their way traditionally into Latin texts. So after about 400, they were included there, but they're included in a bunch of Greek Byzantine texts and stuff like that. Eusebian canon, and we'll look at that because they're a fascinating little thing. They're like a super duper index harmony of the four Gospels. So, well, let's look at them. So here's the Eusebian canons. Eusebius, see the age that Eusebius lived? That's very early. So he has taken these numbered scenes in the Gospels. In fact, the numbered scenes are called the Ammonian sections. There's like 3 or 4 different kinds of names for these Eusebian canons, and the Catholics use Ammonian a lot. But there's sections, subsections inside those large chapter divisions, and there's how many sections there are that they actually catalog. So here's how it works. The Eusebian canons are like this. What if you collected together in one book all the scenes that show up in all 4 Gospels? That would be an interesting thing to know, right? Well, if you take those, you sort of rip them out of the Gospels and you put them in a different book. You don't do that, but technically you take all the scenes that show up in all 4 books, which is a pretty cool thing. That's canon number 1 in the Eusebian canons. It's all the scenes that are in all 4 books. Yeah, Matt? Not necessarily in chronological order, no, but they'll just take all the ones that match. And there's, so you can read those and say, this must be more important because it shows up in all 4 Gospels, but that tells you something. It's in Latin. Yes, so they're originally in Greek, actually, and but they got included in the Latin text most predominantly. But it's interesting. So there's 4. So then the Eusebian canons go down. What if we put all together the ones that show up in 3 Gospels instead of 4? That's the next section right here. These are the ones, see the green, they show up in 3 Gospels. And that's canons 2, 3, and 4. Canon 2 is the one that shows up in Matthew, Mark, Luke. Canon 3, the ones in Matthew, Luke, John. And canon 4, the ones that are in Matthew, Mark, John. So they just collected together the ones that are in threes and the ones that show up in the certain three Gospels. And then you can keep going. So canon number 1, all the ones that show up in all the Gospels. Canon number 2, 3, and 4, the ones that show in 3 Gospels. How about the ones that show up in 2 Gospels? There they are. And so there's canon 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 9, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so that's all the combinations of the ones between 2. And then lastly, the last category is the ones that show up in 1, which is really instructive by itself too. Which of the Gospels, which scenes in the Gospels are unique to just that Gospel. And John pegs the meter on that, but here's how they're separated out. These are back into a single canon. Canon 10, they collect together the ones that are in single places, and then they annotate which one they're from. So again, if you look through the Canon 10 in the Eusebian canons, Canon 10 for John is huge because John's gospel has a lot of unique stuff to it. So anyway, that's the Eusebian canons. It was so helpful especially when the Latin Bibles were being hand copied and printed out. They would use this as the table of contents in the front of the book. Really? Yeah, kind of cool. But then they would, when you got to the body of the book, you still had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They didn't actually put them in the Eusebian canons, but then you'd have to go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and put a little number on the side of the scenes so you know that this is John scene 28, So you would go through in all these books, it has this as the table of contents, and in marginal notes you'd see numbers that mean this is the scene number for these guys. And so it's a little confusing, but... Yeah, it's very much like the Parallel Bible. Or there's a book I have called The Life of Christ in Stereo, which is now out of print. It's interesting because this guy was on his deathbed, a believer, and he's on his deathbed. He's slowly dying, I think, from cancer. This is like in the 70s, I think, late 60s, early 70s. And he decides that what he wants to do before he dies is do a harmonized version of the 4 Gospels and actually write it out harmonized so it reads like a book. And then so he took all the duplicated scenes and, would scrunch them into one scene, add all the details. And it reads like a novel narrative. It's pretty cool. And it's like 80% direct copied out of the Bible, but he had to do some things to make it read right. But he did his, and then he had to make sure they were chronological too. So he did all this work in his deathbed, and on the day he finished it, I think it was that week he died. So it's a great book. I lost my copy, had to buy a new copy online, and I found a used copy someone had sitting on their shelf, and I bought it for $3. But it's pretty cool. It's The Life of Christ in Stereo. It's what this is. So it's a harmonized version of the Gospels. This is the front end of the London canon tables. It's a Byzantine text. It's Greek actually, and this is the table of contents. The Eusebian canons in the front end of those canon tables. So this is what you'd be met with when you go through it, is the Eusebian canons in the front end, and that was the table of contents. So you could easily go, if you wanted to, as you came into the 4 Gospels, you could say, I just want to read the scenes that are in all 4 Gospels. And now I want to read the scenes that are only in 3 Gospels. And you could do it that way. So the Eusebian canon tables are really very common in the 6th through the 9th century in the front ends. Here's one. This is an Armenian text. So these are the Eusebian canons. This was penned in the 13th century, but they were still being used in the 13th century. So it's a long time. The Eusebian canons rule as a table of contents from about the 500s, 600s, all the way through about the 1300s. So they're really super cool. I've never found a Bible today that has a listing of the Eusebian canons. And the reason is because you have to go through the Gospels and put the section numbers next to the sections of the scenes, and nobody does that. And there's hundreds of them. So unless you have a Bible that's annotated like that, then this table of contents doesn't make any sense to you. So, and I love the birds. Okay. So that brings us to illuminated manuscripts. And this is the part where most Christians say this is so secondary to wanting to understand the text of the Gospels. And it is sort of, but it shows you the love that people had during this time for the Word. And also they add some really cool things that help commonize the Word for people who aren't academics. So they added lots of color and a lot of gold and silver. So you've seen these in pictures before. They also have portraits of the evangelists And in the original language, those are called miniatures. And now we've stolen the word miniature, which actually means a portrait. But since they were small, we use that word to mean small. Miniature doesn't mean small then, but it does now. So there's little pictures of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Big deal. And when you see them in the paintings, these are really cool. I mean, the leaves. If it's a Greek text, because they were doing this when Greek was still very dominant, Matthew and John are always pictured as old men. They always have long gray beards. And the other two guys, Mark and Luke, are pictured as young men. It's kind of backwards because John is the youngest guy in the whole group. But, it's just traditional. It has nothing to do with anything. But if you ever see a miniature and there's a guy there and he's got a long beard, then it's likely either Matthew or John. But then the Latin one's even cooler. If you have Latin ones, and this is where they're very predominant, we'll see them in a second, the evangelists are all equated to four living creatures. Because in Ezekiel 1, and was it Revelation 4, there's the four creatures. And someone somewhere decided that you got four creatures and you got four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So let's make each one of them one of those animals. Okay, why not? So this actually will help you. We'll see a couple examples in a second. So, for instance, when you see the living creatures all have wings, but they have different faces. Okay? So don't be put off by the wings. So they all have wings and faces. And the four faces are, if it's a face of a man, it's Matthew. A face of a lion, it's Mark. A face of an ox or a calf, it's Luke. And the face of an eagle is John. Why? We don't know. But you'll see it. It's really kind of cool. So remember that. Matthew, man, lion, ox. Okay, so there we go. So let me just look at these. There's a handful of really cool, very cool illuminated manuscripts that are modestly old. And they're all in Latin. So these are all Latin. And these are the three that we're going to look at. So there's Codex Amiatinus, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Kells. And if you're a textual critic, you won't deal much with these because you're more interested in the original language and how you parse differences and stuff like that. But if you want to go back and really affirm what the original text was when it was first translated into Latin, earliest Latin, these are the books you go to. And they happen to be highly illuminated, highly printed and stuff. So let's take a look. So we're going to start with Amiatinus, which has by itself a fascinating background. It is literally, it's the earliest complete Latin Vulgate Bible we have. Complete, okay? There were 3 copies of a Latin Bible. They were commissioned by this guy, Schilfrid. I don't know how to say his name. In 692, just before 700, at some monasteries in Northumbria. Northumbria. It's the coastal Scotland that looks into the North Sea. That's Northumbria. And it's called Northumberland today by the English. So that's where it's from, very cold and salt air, and we're looking toward the North Sea and stuff. So that's where it comes from. There it is, present-day Scotland. So this is 700. So in 700, they take, now remember, if you go back, the earliest, the oldest, Jerome's Latin is somewhere in the 400s. So here we are about 2 to 3 centuries later, and they want to make a really solid, well done, highly illuminated, wonderful copy of the Latin. So that's what this is. And this is the oldest complete Latin that we have from Jerome. So it's 700 or so. So they make 3 copies of this. Very, very costly to do this. And in fact, this is an interesting sidelight. You can establish when they did this because there was a land grant that was given to Wearmouth Jarrow is a pair of monasteries in that area. There was a land grant given to them money-wise, so they could raise 2,000 head of cattle, because that's what it was going to take to make the 3 books. 2,000 head of cattle. So it was extremely expensive, and that the actual purchase receipt for that land grant, or whatever you want to call it, we have that. So they said, why would 2 monasteries up in Northumberland area, why would they want to do 2,000 heads of cattle? Well, because they were going to slaughter them for the skins to make the Bibles. Whoa, massive investment. So that's how we can pin down the date exactly, the 692. We have the sales receipt for the cattle. Okay, so it turns out those 3 copies get made. Schilfrid decides, since he's kind of in charge of these monasteries, he wants to give 1 copy of this as a gift to the Pope. So he goes and he travels to Rome from Scotland, and on the way he dies. He never makes it to the Pope to give it to him. And it's supposed to go to the Pope in 715. We're not sure if it ever got to the Pope, actually. And then it completely falls out of view until the 9th century, almost over 100 years later, and it's found in Tuscany, Italy, at Monte Amiata. Amiatinus. You are so Amiatinus. Whatever that means. So anyway, so that's how it gets its name. They always get their name from where they come from. Sinaiticus from the Sinai, that stuff. So Amiatinus. So yeah, it falls, it's just gone. No one knows what happens to it because it leaves the radar when Chilford dies on the road. So in the 9th century, it's in Monte Amiata. Interestingly enough, this year is the first time that British-generated document will go back to Britain. So it's been, I counted out, 1,302 years after it was penned up in Scotland. It's going to be on loan to the British Library through 2018. So it comes back to be seen again. And if you see pictures of these are just stunning, just totally stunning to look at. So it's kind of cool that after it gets lost on the road to Rome, and who knows where it goes, it comes back again, and now it's back in the British Isles for the first time in 1,300 years. So let's take some look at it. So here's one of the cover pages in the front of the Gospels. And in the corners of this cover page are the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with their signs. So do you remember who has the face of a man? Matthew. So the guy in the upper left there, that's Matthew, and that's his thing. And then the eagle? John. Oh, you guys are good. Now, if you scan down to the middle of the page, there's the one-eyed Jesus. We don't know why he looks like that. It looks like he's winking with one eye. We don't know why. And then probably 2 angels. No one knows who the angels are. So I know. But it's interesting what he's pointing at. He's pointing at this manuscript is what he's doing. It's his way of saying, he's going, That's exactly, when I see this, I see him going, it's all about me. So, yeah, I laugh every time I see this picture. I go, what? So, yeah. Well, and when you look really closely, I've done this before, if you look at the eye that's winking, it's been retouched. So not a really good retouching, evidently, but it's been retouched if you look at it really closely. So all we really see is his upper eyelid, and we don't see the rest. So anyway, it's kind of funny. So we go to the bottom of the page. The lion, and so this one's the lion right here. So we know the lion is Mark, and then right here the ox or the calf. Most times it looks like a calf head. So that's Luke. So yeah. So anyway, so now you know. The next time you see an illuminated manuscript, you can tell who they are. So I don't know where that tradition comes from or why, but it was a big deal by the time you get to the 500s and 600s. Okay, let's leave that for a second because that's pretty cool. Lindisfarne Gospels, about the same time. They come from a monastery in Lindisfarne. And if you go on, it's funny, I know where Lindisfarne is, so I type Lindisfarne into Google Earth to see if it's where I thought it was, and it takes you to a spot called the Holy Island. Yeah. And it's the right place, actually. There's an island, that Northumbrian coast I talked about, which is that eastern coast that looks into the North Sea from Scotland. There's a little island off the edge of that, and that was turned into a monastery, and that was called Lindisfarne for a long time. But it went back and forth in naming because of the Vikings. It was also a favorite target for the Viking pirates to come and take it apart. So now it's just called the Holy Island. But anyway, yeah, this is in the early 700s in that monastery in Lindisfarne. This guy named Eadfrith, I don't know how you say these guys' names. Yeah. What's that? The original monk, yeah. Nice name for a daughter, Eadfrith. Eadfrith.
It's Edfrith.
Edfrith? Yeah. You think so? I'll take the A is silent. Oh, okay. So Edfrith, we'll take that. Anyway, he's a bishop. See, about the same time, around 700, and this tradition of doing illuminated scriptures was actually really big in the UK area. So there you go. As the monks were escaping Viking pirates, they actually got on a boat and were headed to Ireland, which is where their monk system comes from. They had been put there in the North Sea as kind of an extension of, so they were going back to the mother monastery in Ireland. It gets, this precious thing that they had copied, it gets swept overboard. I mean, they've wrapped it up, in oilcloth and stuff, and they've protected it, and they're going through this gigantic storm. They're almost all the way to Ireland, and this thing just gets swept right off the boat. It's gone. And so they get there safely. They land in Ireland. They go, oh, woe is me. We had this beautiful copy. We were working on it, but it's gone now. And as they're just walking the beach sometime later, it's on the beach. It's great. I just love this kind of stuff. And since it's not on paper, it's on vellums, calf skins, it survives being in the water. And it looks no worse for wear at all. So they pick it up off the beach. And by that time, the whole document's over almost 200 years old. So it's an old document. So that's why we have it today, is because they found it on the beach one day when they were, crying in their coffee. So the one thing that's missing, and this happened before they took off to go back to Ireland, is that in one of the Viking raids, they found the book, and they found the covers. The covers used to be encrusted with jewels and rubies and stuff like that, and sometimes some gold and things like that. So when the Vikings came, they said, well, we don't want the stuff inside, we just want the covers. So they took the covers off. And they left the book, which for us is the higher treasure anyway. And so there's this book without any of its covers on, because that got stripped off by the Vikings. And interestingly enough, several hundred years later, actually it's just barely 100 to 150, someone decided to write the Old English translation of the Latin Vulgate in between the lines of the Latin. So that English that's written in between the lines of Latin is our oldest extant, remember that means surviving, our oldest extant translation of the Gospels in English. So someone asks you about English translations, you can say, did you know that the oldest English translation of the Bible dates to the 900s AD? English. Now it's Old English, like really old English, older than 1611 English, but even still it's English. And it gives you a nice insight too in the translation of English from Latin at the time. Their understanding of Latin is slightly different than ours is because they were closer in time to the authors. So it's an interesting thing. But yeah, they just like penned it in the middle in English. So there it is. And today, if you want to see it, it's in the British Library, London. I haven't seen this. I've seen a lot of things in the British Library, but not this. I wish I'd known this existed, because the last time I was there, I didn't even know it existed. So there's the Lindisfarne Gospels that were hand penned around 700 AD. So that's pretty darn cool. Okay, here's some shots of it. This is the cover page of Matthew, and if you, I'm going to zoom up on a part of it here. Well, that's the question. Who is peeking behind the curtain? Because this guy sitting here, this guy here is Face Man, Matthew. Okay, so we know that this is Matthew. We also know that right here because this is Mattheus, Matthews, that's Matthew. I don't know what this word up here is. It looks like oagios. Like hagios in Hebrew is holy. Wonder if that means holy Matthew? I don't know. I don't know. I didn't look at that word. Anyway, yeah, the question is, there's Matthew working on his text. Saint Matthew. That's probably what it is. Yeah, Saint Matthew. Because, yeah, okay, I'd go for that. We'll pool our ignorance and we'll get there. I don't know. But this is definitely Matthew. Yeah, so who's the guy behind the curtain? And no one really knows necessarily. But it could be Jesus himself, again, holding a book, which is probably this book. So in the same way that in the other Gospels show Jesus in the middle kind of going, right? That might be him behind the curtain saying, because behind the curtain means he's unseen now. So he's peeking out from the curtain saying, this is a good thing. So it's their visual representation of Jesus endorsing because he's holding the finished book, which is interesting because in this picture, Matthew is still writing the book, but when Jesus pokes out from behind the curtain, he's holding a completed book. Because he already knows, that's right. It's fascinating. It's just fascinating. You draw the curtain aside, and there he is, somehow in the background, working his stuff. Okay. Here's a little, one of the title pages right at the beginning of Matthew. They call this the Cairo page, not Cairo, Egypt, but Chi and Rho, the two symbols, the X and the R, the two first letters of Christ, or Cairo. So that ended up being identified with the Christian church very, very early. So they do this Cairo page, and I think you can tell right here that the Lindisfarne Gospel had never quite been finished. They were still working on it when they were going away from the Vikings, because these letters are outlined in the middle, but they're not filled in like the rest of it. And there's a lot of stuff like that in the text. It's pretty much the illuminations. And you can see some of the side notes that have been added and some of the in-between notes. And this is just the title page. There's a close-up. It's crazy. And it's really something. This is all online. Yeah, this is all online. And I have yet to go through all the little notes. There's notes like everywhere. I don't know what those are. But there's some guy had the job of putting red dots in. See the red dots? And some poor other schmuck went through and actually in modern times counted how many dots there are to see. I know, get a life. Anyway, it's brilliant. So that's the Cairo illustration. Okay, one more and then we'll be done. Book of Kells, which is, again, it's just the four Gospels. It has the advantage that it's not only from Jerome's Vulgate, but also the old Latin that started the Vulgate has been referenced. So this is created in a Columban monastery, not Columbian, but Columban. There's a monk named Columban. It's somewhere around 800, 800. So it's about, we're going forward about 50 to 100 years from Lindisfarne. And Britain or Ireland, we're not sure. This one was also unfinished. And you can tell because the Eusebian canons are too condensed. They're not quite filled out enough. And there's no number markings in the text you cross-reference to the Eusebian canon from. So you can't go to the right section without the sections being marked. That's not in this. So that would be added later. So it's named for the Abbey of Kells, which is near Dublin, which it was at for centuries. In fact, it's really highly, if you talk to anyone who's Irish, you ask them about Kells and they'll tell you, oh yeah, that's like a treasure for us. It's now at Trinity College. This one's online as well, and you can pick through it and you can look at it close up. I took a couple of close-ups here in a second. Considered Ireland's finest national treasure. So this is a pretty cool deal. And there's the Eusebian canons, but there's not quite enough information in them. And they're also super dense, almost impossible to use. And they run off the page down here. So that's the front end of the Eusebian canon that's on it. And they have a picture page too of the four evangels. So here we go again. Here's your last chance. So face of a man, and there's the lion, and there's the ox or the calf, and there's the eagle. So the man, of course, is Matthew. The lion is Mark. The ox or the calf is Luke, and then the eagle's John. So a really dominant kind of idea, these four evangels. I don't know why. I don't know. It's interesting. Here's the beginning of Luke that has a genealogy of Christ, and they decided to lay it out kind of in a table form, which is pretty cool, and actually put numbers to help you with the generations. So, but you can see some of them in there. But this is not the only page of it. It is more than that. So, and then here's a close-up on a Cairo page that they had. The Chi and the Rho aren't in this picture. This is like the size of a stamp size zoom in on part of the Cairo page that they have in Kells. So we talk about the, what do they call it, the knots in the Irish kind of stuff. Here it is in spades. So, and when you look at this closely, they're crossing and undering like it's astonishing. Someone spent I don't know how long on just doing this postage stamp size of the knots that are a small part of the Cairo page. So, yeah, they're big. And interestingly enough, they didn't finish the Book of Kells, but they did finish this stuff. I don't know what that tells you either, but that's just kind of fascinating. Okay, I think that's the end of that. Yeah, that's the end of that. So those are the special Latin ones, which aren't cool just because they're illuminated. They're cool because they go back to the 600s and 700s, which is still extraordinarily old. So That's interesting. So any thoughts on these? And I'll tell you where we're going next after that.